G'day, I'm here to show you today a problem that the customer is talking about was noisy brake pads. So I'm going to remove the brake caliper and pads and have a good look at them and make sure that there's nothing stuck in the pad or something that could create that noise. So to do that we need to remove the pads, and to start the process the pad retaining pin's like basically a split pin and one end of it is bent over. So what we need to do is to bend the end of the split pin upwards using a screwdriver. And we use the anchor bolt that's just sitting below the split pin, and we just apply a little bit of upward pressure on the pin till it actually straightens. You could use a pair of needle nose pliers as well, but this method seems to work pretty well. So now I've done that. It's just the reason I've done that now first is so that when I take the caliper out it's a little bit harder to hold the caliper while you're trying to straighten the end of the pin. So now I'll go ahead and remove the actual caliper. So the two anchor bolts here, we'll use an Allen key. Loosen the two off first. Now these two bolts are held in with Loctite, and that's to prevent the screws from coming loose under rough operating conditions. So when you reinstall this you'll need to put Loctite back on them. The Loctite also makes them a bit sticky coming out, so you've got to persevere a little bit to get the screws out. Okay, the two screws are out, and now I'll slip the caliper off the disc and away from the forks. And you can see here there's the pad sitting in the caliper, but you really can't see what the pad condition's like, so the best way to look at the pad is to take it right out. So previously we bent the pin, so now I can remove that pin out through the side, and that'll allow you to now push the pads out through the bottom of this caliper. I use the pin actually because it just gives me a little bit of extra length in my fingers that won't fit down that little hole. So once you push the pads out a little bit, you can grab hold of them, give them a pinch, because they've got a spring clip that holds them together. Carefully leave the caliper sit there. And here we have the pads. And the pads have a special spring clip that holds the pads spread when they're in the caliper, so that they clear the disc so we don't get the pad noise scraping on the disc altogether. So I'll lay these pads down now so we can have a good look at them. And the special little clip. So looking at the surface of the pad, you can see that there's little flakes of metal and stuff in it which is supposed to be in there. They're called a composite material. And the pads themselves don't look like they've got any excessive wear on them. They're certainly well down, they're not long off being replaced. Check your specifications to see what the minimum thickness are for Shimano brake pads, but they normally tell you it's the thickness from the pad face to the backing of the actual pad, so check with your specs to see that. I can't see any real reason apart from a bit of dust that would be causing the brake noise on this particular pad, so I'll have a look at the other one. And it's pretty much the same. There's no marks, no grooves, nothing in the pad that would indicate something that's protruding that would cause a noise, so we can sort of eliminate the pads from being the problem. The only other thing that can cause the problem is the actual disc itself, so we're going to have a look at the disc and see if there's any problems that would be with the disc, and we'll have a look around the surface on both sides, looking for any cracks or discoloration or hot spots etc. that might have formed on the disc. And at the moment I can't really see anything that would indicate there's a problem with the disc. Okay, so we've now got the pads out and we've had a look. We're going to check the caliper and see that there's no leaks, whether the piston seals are leaking or not. So we have a good look inside here, and if there was any leaks you would see fluid and dust collected on that fluid, but these look very good. There's no worries at all with those, so we'll leave those alone. So I think at the end we can put it down to possibly a bit of dust. So what I'll do is I'll clean the pads, and I'll use a bit of fine emery and I'll clean the disc, and then we'll reassemble it and we'll test it and see whether we've fixed the problem. I'll bring a piece of emery in to do this job so the surface is nice and flat. I'm just going to give them a light rub. So I take the pad and I tip it upside down on the bit of emery. I give the pad a light rub in a circular motion just to clean the surface of the pad. Turn that over and have a look. You can see that I haven't covered all the pads, so I'll give it a little bit more. I'm only using a 400 grit emery paper so that I don't take too much of the pad material away. I basically just want to clean the surface. And I'll give that a little bit more. And we're not looking too bad there. Put that back in place and I'll grab the other pad and I'll give it a light rub as well. So what this does is cleans any impurities off the surface of the pad, just roughs them up a little bit so that when they actually are operating they're going to be less likely to have any noise in them. Yep, and you can see I'm getting that nice little bit of rough surface there. A couple of applications of the brake and they'll be nice and smooth again. So that's enough emery. I checked the disc and it doesn't look too bad, so I'm going to leave the disc alone, but if it was really discoloured bluish or whatever, I would probably give it a light rub as well with some 400 or 600 wet and dry. But at the moment I think that's fine, so I'll leave that alone. Just to finish the job, I'll get a rag and I'll sit the pads on top of the rag and I'll use a product called Brake Clean. Just give that a quick squirt, and what the Brake Clean does is cleans any impurities that are still on the pad, washes them off, and it's white spirit so it'll evaporate in air, so anything that was on that pad will basically just evaporate away when it dries. So I'll give them a bit of a pat. Okay, so now we'll reverse the process and we'll put the pads back into the caliper and then we can reassemble it. So now I'll reassemble the spring clip back with the pads. Put that one over, pick the two pads up, and now we'll put them back in the caliper. Okay, so grab the caliper with one hand, give the pads a little bit of a squeeze and slip them back inside the caliper, pushing them in gently. And once you've got them in, you've got to line up the hole that goes through the pads and the spring clip that holds them all in place. So I'll pick up the split pin and I'll put that in. And as you put the pin in, just rotate it because the pin's got an extended bit on one side, so if you rotate it, it helps just line up the pin, and the pin goes all the way through both sides of the caliper. Okay, so the pads are now sitting back in the caliper and that all looks all ready and nice to go back together. So before I can put the caliper back on, these were normally held in. The screws had a product called Loctite fitted to them to stop the screws from coming undone. So before I refit these screws, I've got to actually give them a clean first and also give the holes where they were a clean as well. So I'm just going to give that screw a bit of a clean first, so using a brass wire brush which is fairly soft, not too aggressive. Just give the screw a bit of a rub on the end and that'll just take off the dry Loctite that's still sitting on the screw. So there you go, all nice and clean. I'll grab the other one and we'll repeat the process. We'll give it a clean as well. And same, that screw's now clean and ready to go. And last but not least, I'm going to clean the holes where the threads are on the forks. I'm going to give them a wipe out as well to remove any excess. So I'm going to use a piece of rag to give that thread in there a bit of a clean out. There's a bit of Loctite you can see just sitting in there. I'll just flick that out. But I'm going to screw the piece of rag in and then screw it out. And that should bring out any of the dry Loctite that's left in there. That should bring that out. Now I'll just screw it out. And give that a light blow. And then repeat the same with the bottom hole. And screw it out. And there's a little bit more just coming out. I'll get rid of that. And those holes are nice and clean, ready for the screws to go in now. So the next point, we'll use some Loctite. So take the lid off the Loctite, grab your screw, tip your bottle up, and you only need just a small amount, so 1 drop is heaps of Loctite on that screw. So that screw is ready to put back in the hole now. So I'm going to put that screw in now. Doesn't matter whether you put the top one or the bottom one in first, that doesn't matter. And then I'll repeat the process with the other screws. So now I'm going to apply a small amount of Loctite to the second screw, and that's heaps, that's all you need. So I'll fit that screw now into the caliper. So fitting that screw. The other thing you notice when you clean the old Loctite out, the actual screws screw in and out much easier, because the old dry Loctite makes them bind a bit. Okay, so now I've got that sitting on there. The next thing I'll do is I'll tighten that up. So now I'm going to nip these up with my Allen key, and then I'm going to tension them, but before I do that I've got to centralise the caliper on the disc first. So to do that, I'll pull the handbrake lever and squeeze it, and while I've got it squeezed I can nip up these screws. Operate your brakes and make sure that the pads are moving evenly, which they are. Okay, so once the caliper's mounted, we need to bend the split pin, the end of the split pin down again so that the pin doesn't fall out. So please don't forget this operation, it's very important. So I grab the end of the split pin with a pair of pliers. Put my hand in there to hold the pin in place. And you can see I've only just bent it off a little bit of an angle, but that'll stop that pin falling out and not losing the brakes. So the last stage of this now is to actually tension them with a tension wrench. So this is one form of tension wrench that's used quite widely in the automotive industry. So I've got my adapter and a 5mm hex head screw. Put those two together. You need to check your specs to see what tension you should actually do this up to. I've had a look and I've got the tension, so all I do now is I'll set the sliding scale up to that right tension, lock it, make sure the little spring-loaded pin is pushed in, and now the tension wrench is ready to actually use to tension those screws. Okay, so put the tension wrench in, and you hear the little click, that's the actual tension now set. Do it twice just to make sure that you've got it properly torqued. Do the second one. And those screws now are properly torqued. So that now should complete the job. Just make sure your brake line's not caught up or anything while you've had the caliper off, but that all looks good to me. And the caliper's now properly tensioned, and hopefully that'll solve the customer's problem and the brake squeal will be gone. Okay, see you next time.